Hello, I'm Terry Meir, and I'll be your host today. We at Sustainable Kashi are proud to provide these free classes every week to help deeper connect to our ecosystem. Feel free to learn more about our project at sustainablekashi.com. If you have any questions, please type them in the chat box, and we'll make sure we get answers for you. Today, we are talking with Robyn Francis. She has dedicated the past 30 years to empowering people to be effective agents of change. Her students include some of permaculture's leading teachers and activists. Robyn was the founding director of Permaculture International back in 1987. She's the designer and the creator of Djanbung Gardens, which is one of Australia's leading permaculture centers. I've had the privilege of visiting the center, and it is an impressive site. So thank you for joining us today, Robyn, and we look forward to hearing all you have to share.
Oh, thank you, Terry. Yes, lovely to connect up from the other side of the planet. Yeah, we're here in the subtropics of Australia, so similar climate to Florida. But yeah, here we're in the middle of summer or getting towards the tail end of summer, and it's lush and wet and humid and warm and really lovely. I believe you guys have had a bit of a cold spell over there with the polar vortex and all that stuff.
Yes, it's been unusually cold here, but today it's nice and warm, and we actually had a little bit of rain, so it's very nice.
Oh, that's good. That's good to hear. Well, I thought I'd share some of my thoughts about human settlements. And I might flip into a full screen mode so you get some images in a moment. I've been involved in sort of eco-villages and community development since the 1970s. The intentional community movement in Australia, lobbying and submitting to state government about legislation to enable intentional communities, and I've consulted on many and designed a number of communities and eco-villages over the years. And for me, you know, it's at that bioregional and it's at that human settlement level that we've got the greatest capacity for meaningful change. And I think, you know, as we sort of grapple with the realities of climate change and ecological breakdown, and you know, and also the pandemic that we're dealing with at the moment, although we're very fortunate here in Australia compared to most of the rest of the world. I think, you know, these are stark reminders that business as usual is just not going to cut it. But we can only do so much as individuals. And that's why I'm so passionate about community. And not just designing new communities, but how we can actually revitalize and build the resilience of communities that already exist. So I'll show you some images and pictures, and we'll just go through a quick tour of some of my thoughts, and then see what questions you have. And a lot of permaculture design is actually revolved around patterning, perceiving patterns that exist, historic ones, current ones, looking at trends, where they might move to in the future. And so it is with human settlements. And so we find historically we've lived in small communities. And up until the early 1900s, so just a little over a century ago, more than 80% of the planet's population lived in small villages. And it was only in 2011 that we passed the critical 50% of our almost 8 billion human population living in cities. And if we look historically, that's how, you know, what we're designed for. We're social animals designed to be comfortable and live in smaller communities. And so what are some of the features of these, and how do we actually move forward with these concepts into the future? So if we look at human settlements as being ecosystems, within permaculture, we're embracing the aspects of social permaculture and sort of design for people. We're looking at cultural ecology. So each culture is different, and we also get ethnic diversity within and human diversity within any given community. We need to design the physical environment so it supports good social systems, and as well as, you know, good environmental ends. And of course, there's the invisible structures which pervade everything. And the invisible structures are all about the rich relationships that we develop through design and with intent. It also includes things like governance and economic systems and legal systems and so forth. So, you know, what we're aiming for with our human settlements is that they're human scale. And the best measure of that is, are things walkable? You know, how well can you survive on your feet? A rich web of social interactions, a feeling of connectedness, a deep connectedness with nature. We are actively engaged in community building and committed to creating systems that are resilient and adaptable. And a lot of that can actually be achieved through good governance and good human relationships. So I like David Holmgren's, what he calls domains. And this is a beautiful image that somebody developed from that. And so these different domains or areas of activity can go from, you know, the context of our, you know, our home environment to the community, right out to the greater bioregion and beyond. And it's, you know, as you're probably now aware, you know, permaculture is a lot more than just gardening and growing our food. So the domains become really critical when we're working on that, you know, greater community and bioregional level, looking at our finance and economics, tools and technology that we're using, our built environment, community governance, land and nature stewardship, our health and well-being, and culture and education. So, and we could, you know, we could spend days just unpacking each of these threads. But as I say, just introducing and flagging these things for you to look and consider more down the track. As a community facilitator and permaculture designer, my core aims include sort of building on and integrating with what exists. Don't throw the baby out with the bathwater, so to speak. Being responsive to community and giving the community the space to explore problems, to explore solutions through participatory processes. Then I'm the expert and I'm telling you what's going to work and what to do. It's got to be inclusive. And it's important that we're constantly attuned to a sense of place and community spirit. So what are the things in the environment, the physical environment and the community environment that give people that sense of place, that sense of belonging? And then always maintaining that sort of macro to micro perspective. It's so easy to sort of get stuck on details and miss the big picture, or sometimes we're too enamored of the big picture, thinking that we miss some of the little details which are really important signals. And we're looking at this in both space and time. So past, present, future. One of the tools that I developed back in the 80s, late 80s, was what I call ESM, Eco-Social Matrix. It's a catchment planning framework. So looking at human settlements and communities from a bioregional perspective, and we can then sort of zoom in and out. We can use this process in a fractal sense. We can do it for an individual property. We can do it for a neighbourhood, an entire bioregion, or even greater. So it's looking at our bioregional or neighbourhood context. The catchment framework is we're sort of unpacking the factors around the natural environment and catchment, our social catchments, and our services catchments. And within that, we'll find that there's different orders of human settlements that provide for needs on different levels. So I'll just introduce you very briefly to these. With the natural and land use catchment, it's not only our watersheds, but looking at all our natural environment and assets and natural disasters and the social systems and governance systems that interact with those. And that includes agriculture and forestry and all aspects of land use planning. Then with the social catchments, we're looking at where people go to meet their needs and the different sort of bubbles of catchments there. So you can sort of see with the little diagram here, we've got a major town, we've got some little hamlets, we've got a village. And so we'll find different levels of services available at each of these orders. And so it's not only looking at, you know, what facilities or what education or what health is available in the town, but in a major village, or how far people have got to travel to meet those needs. I know live on the edge of a very well-serviced village where we've got, you know, we've got doctors, we've got a little hospital, we've got a nice little shopping centre where we can meet most of our needs. We've even got a hairdresser and, you know, legal services and lots of community services. But, you know, if I was to say live in one of the smaller villages, a little just over in the next valley, I would, to access the services I get in this village, I would have to commute 30 kilometres to the next major town. And so if you start looking at sort of like setting up communities or eco-villages, you're, you know, setting things up for generations of people that are going to have these huge pressures of distance and proximity in terms of meeting their needs. And right at a time where we need to start weaning ourselves off individual motor cars and the convenience of that. And so these social catchments can also help us identify in rural areas the nodes where people could effectively walk or cycle to come together. And then maybe from there we can have our community transport or carpooling systems to get to larger centres. So, you know, really looking strategically at our catchments and our nodes and our corridors. And then, of course, with the services catchment, we're looking at energy, water, waste recycling. We're looking at communication networks, transport networks, and government services and banking and finance. So once we sort of do a thorough analysis of these, we've got a really good picture of, you know, our strengths and where our gaps are and the areas that we need to focus on. And just bringing things like the hamlet and the village back into our working vocabulary, because so much of planning, so much of legislation, so much of infrastructure is geared towards the larger human settlements at the expense of the smaller ones, where we can really start to build community. So the numbers are referring to the number of households. So with hamlets, you know, you've got tens of households. There might be a little general store. There might be a public school or primary school. With a village, you're looking at hundreds of households. and maybe populations from sort of, 500 up to a couple of thousand. With towns, we're looking at the thousands of households. And of course, we're going to get more facilities and services in those than in a village. And then we have our provincial cities, which are in the tens of thousands of households. Then we come up to actual cities. So, cities, we'd be talking about the, San Francisco's and places like that. And then, over the past 50 odd years, half century, we've seen the emergence of the megapolis, where we're looking at the tens of millions of households, the Sao Paulos, the Beijings, the Shenzhens, these massive monsters. And some of these are growing at an alarming rate, especially in the third world. And these are disasters. They're social disasters, they're environmental disasters. These are huge populations who are exceptionally vulnerable. Look at where the worst cases of the current coronavirus have been. It's in these densely populated cities. And it's not only people suffering from the actual virus itself, but from isolation when there's lockdowns and having no access to the out of doors and the open space. And I mean, here, something like a lockdown is no issue. I've got my garden, I'm out in the garden and having a wonderful time without interruption. But I really feel for people who are stuck in these small apartments. But and there's been a big focus on sort of like eco-villages and new communities. Many of them are greenfield sites, so sort of getting a piece of land and starting from scratch. There is a lot of energy and resources goes into building something from scratch. And what's interesting with the eco-village movement in Europe is that a lot of those eco-villages and co-housings are actually buying up old warehouses, old iron foundries, old institutions, or buying up abandoned villages and revitalizing those. So you've got all that infrastructure that already exists that's just waiting to be retrofitted, renovated, and built on. And then we've got, communities everywhere, urban and rural, where there's a lot of opportunity to start to bring people together and make a difference. So, build on what exists, nurture community trust. Without community trust, so we've got to build bridges, develop resilience, identify the opportunities, especially the opportunities that are going to bring people together rather than, sort of fracture them. So you might actually park some critical issues until you get people on board and they're starting to work together and they're starting to trust each other across, cultural and political divides. We need to invest in human resources and reduce our dependence on things that are imported from outside of the bioregion, and definitely enhance and work on that strong sense of place. Because if people have got a strong sense of place and belonging, they will want to protect that. And if they're, if they see Walmart or whatever as being their means of survival, then they'll defend that to the death, okay? So we need to sort of bring in these new paradigms, and things like farmers markets and stuff are great for starting to break down barriers that are sort of fairly politically neutral. And, there's a lot of inspiration from Portland in terms of neighbourhood sharing and building people spaces in an urban environment, and just little things like, the footpath library, or I love the idea of the, this is a little toy library here where kids can put their toys that they're bored with instead of chucking them in the trash bin, and creating incidental seating for, to make it nice for people to sort of sit down and meet each other. And there's lots of very soft and subtle ways that we can start to build, human relationships. I've done a lot of community facilitation over the years and facilitating participatory planning processes for problem solving and design. So I've done this in many places, but also in my own community here in Nimbin, where we've worked on food security, water security, housing, energy, transport, our local economy, social services that are available, education and information, and community disaster management. And that last one is going to be one of the really big ones, and it might be one of the hooks to get people involved, because as our climate and ecosystems break down even further, we're going to be experiencing even more severe and frequent natural disasters, as well as the unnatural ones, or I suppose, you know, in a way, COVID is also a natural disaster, isn't it? And because it's arising from our degradation and impact on wild places and the liberation of these viruses to jump species. So here in our local community, we've been working for many years on food security and conducting surveys to raise community awareness, but also doing consultative processes with growers, with landowners, with retail outlets, you know, shops and groceries and cafes and restaurants in the village, and making them aware of, you know, what is actually available locally, and being proud to actually present that, getting the farmers markets going. So we've got two here. We've got one right in the heart of the village on Wednesday afternoons, and then there's one in another little village just a few kilometres down the road on Saturday mornings. Our local major centre, Lismore, which is just 30 kilometres away or 20 miles, has got 4 farmers markets a week in different locations and different themes. And I mean, this has been fantastic also for our local farmers, like our local rice farmer who used to have to work a couple of days in town to make ends meet. Well, with the farmers markets, he's actually earning a full livelihood from his farm and selling his produce. And we can source, you know, 80 to 90% of our total diet from within less than a 50-mile radius. Actually, a lot of it comes from within a 20-mile radius of where I live. And that just feels so good. And then when we've had crises, it's really held us in good stead, having so much wonderful food available locally. As a community, we've worked on energy. And so in 2010, after a series of community meetings and processes, we set up a solar purchase club, and 70 plus people installed grid interactive solar systems on their rooftops, and a local business sort of offered a really good bulk deal for those. And there's in the immediate valley, there's over 150 standalone solar and micro hydro systems on rural properties and rural communities. And then 2011, we got funding to set up a 45 kilowatt community solar farm. And so those solar panels are spread out over 6 different community buildings throughout the village. And the income from that covers the wage for Nimbin's environmental officer or sustainability officer. That helps to coordinate the ongoing programs. And so we don't have to wait for governments to do it. You know, I mean, we can come together as communities and we can do these things. And then since then, more and more of the shops in town that have got a fantastic sort of north-facing roof, that's our solar aspect in winter here, 8 of those have got very large solar displays sort of that are over 100 kilowatts each. So on a sunny day, over 75% and sometimes more than 100% of the energy consumed by the village and surrounding community in the valley here, that's 3,000 rural households, comes from the sun. And so, you know, maybe one day in the not too distant future, when we've got an improved battery technology, not depending on lithium, there's other alternatives, but they're yet to roll out, that are far more environmentally friendly. It would be great to sort of see the storage capacity and the entire valley just switch off from the grid. So that's our ultimate aim there. And so these aren't just pipe dreams, you know, we're already well on the path. Actually, this picture here, you can see that blank area there in the middle of our village. There were 3 shops there and the Rainbow Cafe that burnt down some years ago, and it was a huge tragedy for the village. And then a month after that happened, our organic shop said that they were closing their doors at the end of the month. So we organised a meeting in the hall and 70 people turned up, and we decided that we'd take the business over as a food co-op, and the owners of the business were there and said they would support that process. And so we had the meeting on Monday. The shop closed its doors on Friday, and the next Monday it opened as Nimbin Food Co-op. So for a community to be able to respond so immediately to change, really, it needs a degree of trust. And for me, that was really heartening, because I bring this story, I've brought these stories around the world, and you wouldn't believe the number of people who say, oh my God, we've been talking about setting up a food co-op for the past 12 years and we're still arguing about it. You guys did it in 5 days. But, you know, it's like anything. I mean, you can't be a marathon runner without doing your warm-ups, without training yourself. And so every little thing that you do with community, that's building on community relationships and trust and resilience and tools and so on, is building for the future. And then when a crisis hits, there's already systems and communications in place. I mean, we live in a rainforest region, some of the highest rainfall in Australia. We've got these ancient rainforests that stretch right back to the Gondwana times, when the first flowering plants emerged, and these forests have never burnt. And 18 months ago, after 3 years of drought and incredible heat waves and stuff, our local World Heritage listed rainforest started to burn. And it was a massive job with our local bushfire brigade and from the local community. But the way everybody kicked in, I mean, an intentional community of 300 people had to evacuate, and evacuated and set up a tent city in the showground just down the road from me here. And we've got the Country Women's Association that were making lunches for the firefighters, and we've also people in the community were bringing down food for people who had evacuated, and just, you know, incredible response. And then we came out of the bushfires, and then it was pandemic and the big lockdown. And so our local Nimbin Valley Dairy started to do deliveries of milk and stuff. And people reached out to their neighbours you know, if they needed anything, that they could do the shopping for them, especially vulnerable people who are older. And it was just incredible seeing how the community just spontaneously managed to cover all bases. And I think in many ways, like the fire and the pandemic really showed to us what works well in our community and what are the areas we need to focus on. As a result of the fire, we have received some funding to support a community disaster management plan development. So at the moment, we're actually going through the processes of community consultation, assessing our risks and strategies for preparation for response and recovery, and how we can extend cooperation across all community sectors, and also integrate that with climate action. I mean, usually here we're preparing for the impacts of floods and being cut off from our major supply sources. Yeah, fire is now on the agenda, as well as severe storms, and hopefully the pandemic doesn't sort of hit our lovely region here. But yeah, we just need to be careful and vigilant, and we're very fortunate that life is sort of almost normal here at the moment, and that, you know, one of the few good things that our government has done is actually take this seriously and listen to the experts and take it on board. So that's my village here, and that's my place here, Djanbung Gardens, and then there's a whole eco-village next door that I designed and all that stuff. So there we go. So in a nutshell, covered a lot of ground in half an hour there, didn't I? Your
Yes,
thoughts,
you did.
Gary?
Oh my goodness, you are one of my inspirations, and I'm so happy to be able to have met you and to spend as much quality time as I have. And one of the things that impressed me the most with your stories is your involvement in starting new communities. And I know you were talking about the eco-village you started next door. And I know we have some people on these calls that are really interested in starting their own community. So when you spoke of the sizes of communities around the world, what have you found to be the most successful? Is there a size that you've really seen work?
Look, it really depends. A lot depends on governance systems. A lot depends on social design. I've seen, you know, sort of, I've seen like co-housings where you've got really sort of like dense semi-detached housing, sort of a high population on a small parcel of land, but they've got a really good social design, they've got really good governance systems, and they work really well. And I've seen other ones with a similar number of people or even less people, big properties spread out all over the place, and not very good social design, and inadequate governance systems that just fail miserably. I think proximity is really important. It's, you know, for remote communities, there are massive rollovers. People just sustain themselves socially and economically. And it's easy to sort of get caught up in the false economy of large properties, low dollars per acre, which are usually remote and a long way from, you know, towns, services, education, employment opportunities, things like that. And that sort of really puts a lot of pressure on people. And I consulted for a community here in Australia that had been going for 20 years. It was on a large property, I think a couple of 100 acres. There were, I think, around sort of 20, 25 adults living there. I don't know how many children. They were about 15 miles or so from the nearest small town, and a good sort of like 30, 40 miles away from the next larger town. Everybody was struggling on social security benefits. One person had part-time work in town. They were crippled with poverty consciousness, mainly trying to keep their motor cars on the road so they could get to that next big town to go to the supermarket to buy cheap food. And they didn't have the money to buy fencing materials to put up a fence to keep the wallabies and the little kangaroos out so they could grow their own gardens, so to speak. And I was asked to come down and do a 2-day workshop with them. So the first day we looked at, food and building and sort of ideas for building modular houses, looking at what resources they actually had there that they could use for building, and how dealing with weeds and all that sort of nitty-gritty stuff. And the second day, I wanted to go into the invisible structures, and particularly economic and governance. They didn't want to go there. They kept on saying, oh, lantana, or mentioning different weeds. I said, no, we dealt with that yesterday. I said, okay, I've got a job for you to do. I want each household to write down how much it costs you every year to keep your motor vehicle on the road for fuel, oil, essential repairs, compulsory insurance, registration, and then we added that up. Now, this was back in the early 90s. That community was hemorrhaging $55,000 a year, keeping their motor cars on the road. And back then, you could build a very nice house for $50,000. And that's one thing I didn't mention in my introduction. There were only 2 completed houses on this community. Everybody else was living in tents, caravans, and temporary sheds. And so how do we rationalize these things? Not only to become more resilient, but the further you have to commute to something, the more it's going to cost you, and the more it costs society. And things have got to change radically in the next decade, or we have got a dismal future ahead of us. So yeah, I think there's some of the personal freedoms and rights that we've come to really cherish and value, that we've just got to start to wean ourselves off and shift more into a mindset of responsibility, and not over to each other here and now, but to the future, to our children, to our grandchildren.
Absolutely. Yeah, I completely agree. And one of my favorite concepts of yours is that of the catchments, and not just catching water like many of us think of, or catching fertility in the soil, but you take it to a social component, which I really appreciate. I've seen many communities have all the food and water they could use, yet they can't talk to each other. So are there any tools that you could recommend to help people learn to catch those social skills?
I think one of the issues I see, people come into intentional communities thinking everybody's going to be a carbon copy of themselves, and with very high expectations of how they're going to all be working together and doing all this together and doing all that together. Community essentially is about being a good neighbour. And you need diversity in a community. You need diversity of age, background, sort of philosophy, culture, ethnicity. It's really important that we embrace difference as a strength, and don't see it as an enemy because somebody is not exactly the same as me. So I think there's major attitudinal changes that need to happen before anything else can, move ahead. And then in addition to that, having good governance systems. There's some brilliant systems that have been pioneered by the co-housing movement in Scandinavia, especially in Denmark. And I think there, that's where you look for good governance systems for communities. But you see, a lot of things go pear-shaped because you get a couple of bullies in there. And look, a community is a microcosm of a macrocosm. Okay? And you'll get a couple of bullies in there, and then you'll get the wannabe bullies who become the bully enablers, and they will, railroad everything. And they will always stop, and they'll prevent any changes to governance that empowers everybody else and takes their control away. So it's really important to have good governance systems right from the start, so that bullies and wannabe bullies don't get a toe in the door. Okay, they might live there, but they're just another person. They'll just have to bully their chickens or something instead of their neighbours. But that's really important. And I think also, like, just the expectations of how people are going to be involved in community activities and land and all that sort of stuff. And people have lives, people have family, people have commitments. People, might only have gotten in there because they've got a mortgage and they've got and if it's a greenfield site, they've got to build their house, they've got to make their garden, they've got to, and they're raising their kids at the same time. So you've got to recognize that there's a lot of pressures on people, and they're not just going to have loads of time and energy to put into community stuff. And we've got to be really gracious about those expectations and accept that people are going to have varying levels of input depending what's happening in their lives. And, are there ways that we can actually help or support them or ease the pressure? So I think, for a community to work, there has to be a lot of tolerance, there has to be a lot of compassion. And once again, good governance systems.
I agree completely. I have just one more question for you. And it's really impresses me to watch people grow through time, kind of like a tree grows up into an old growth apex species. And I want to ask, I love to see people like yourself who have been doing this for so long and have seen so many changes. What would the mature Robyn Francis tell the newbie Robyn Francis just coming into the world? What advice would you give her to kind of either lighten her spirits or help her along the way?
That's a tough question. That is a tough question. I suppose, yeah, so look, some of the biggest disasters in my life have happened because I wanted to please people. And so I would just say, be true to yourself. And I mean, I feel really fortunate that I grew up in a family that really honoured compassion and frugality. So all those things were seriously embedded. But I think, as an empathetic and compassionate being, you can be vulnerable to people abusing your generosity. And so, yeah. But then I think, the old, what we call the BS radar, I mean, that develops and fine tunes with experience and time. So yeah, just hang in there, Robyn, and just keep chipping away. Make sure you're true to your heart.
Well, we are all very fortunate that you did hang in there, and we're all fortunate to have you here in the community. I would like for you to, I understand you're doing online classes now. Could you share with us a little bit about how we get more information?
Yes, so look, I've got a permaculture gardener course happening online. It's 3 modules. The first one is plant wisdom. and sort of understanding plants, how we work with them, a little bit on ecological design and seed saving. The second module is on soil, and that's with Angela Skian, soil and pests and weeds, integrated pest and weed management, and she's absolutely brilliant with that stuff. And sort of plant nutrition, and making sure your vegetables really rock. And then the third module is more about planning for food abundance throughout the year, and with a special emphasis on some of our wonderful, tropical edible tubers, our incredible edible tropical tubers that I love so much and grow so well in this climate. Yeah, there's the three modules there. You can do individual ones, or you can do the three together. And all that information's on our website, permaculture.com.au.
I always tell people and recommend that people take classes from people who are doing it. And you, Robyn, have done this for so very long, and we're so lucky to have you teaching.
Yeah. And they all have got exclusive resources that go with them, handbooks and all sorts of things. So, yeah.
Thank you so much.
I love what I do. And so I love sharing it and sharing the passion. Mm-hmm. And we just need more of it happening out there. Permaculture needs to go viral.
Yes, I completely agree. And I thank you for taking the time to spend with us today. And I want to thank you, and I want to thank everybody watching. You all make this happen with your donations and your support, and we're very lucky to have you all here. I've always been impressed by watching new ecosystems emerge, and the young pioneer species compete with the harsh environments. They're fighting for their water, for the space, for the nutrients. But as they mature, they compete less, and they start to support other plant species within that system. And I love seeing this transformation, because it gives me hope that we can all support each other in similar ways. I'm grateful for all the people like Robyn, who've spent so much time nurturing the soil for us all to grow in. So I hope we have the wisdom to continue to work together. Thank you, everyone, for joining us in this discussion, and we look forward to seeing you next week. Thank you, Robyn.
Thank you, Terry. Bye.